Despite its colorful and welcoming aesthetic, Dust: An Elysian Tail is a story about the fallout of war, so it's fitting that one of the best ways it explores its themes is through its bosses. Dust is a gorgeously designed game and one of my favorites, and I think we can learn quite a bit about its design philosophy through looking at how its boss designs interplay with the levels around them and the themes around them. So get your Kimbap and your spare Nimbat, cause we're gonna dig right in. Dust has one of the most fluid and user-friendly control schemes and combat systems I've ever had the joy to experience. Actions and attacks flow into one another like a dream, and you can also cancel out of actions at the drop of a hat, giving you essentially complete control over your actions. Combine that with the responsive and tight jumping, and you've got a difficulty metric where mistakes generally feel like your fault rather than the game. And I'll be honest, judging just from the standard difficulty, I never found Dust an especially hard game. And that's fine, I don't really play games for the raw challenge of it anyway. But even so, it does have a very nice ebb and flow to its encounters and areas. For our purposes, I'm counting a boss as any enemy that has a big yellow life bar at the bottom of the screen, even if that same boss might become a standard enemy later. These golem type guys are the first truly big enemy you'll face, and it's like, holy crap, I'm still learning the mechanics and you're hitting me with a tree? Then you get right into it and you realize the brute roots aren't that bad. You're getting two things out of this encounter. It's good parry practice, and it's good practice in dodging instead of just attacking all the time. So this encounter is where it is for your mechanical benefit more than anything, because later on you'll have already needed to internalize and rely on these techniques like muscle memory. A whole lot of well-designed games do this, laundering teachable moments through in-game encounters rather than holding you aside at the very start for a tutorial. And hey, after beating the golems, you get to take a breather in town, talking to NPCs, advancing the main plot, and maybe starting a few side quests. When you do go back into the wilds, your path through the forest will ultimately take you to Denim, a town in flames, its people dead. This brings us to Fuse, our first true boss. Now, the big bosses in Dust generally need to be designed to compensate for the fact that your Dust Storm technique is so powerful. It's one of those stats in the upgrade screen that has nested value over time, and you might not notice as much of a difference right away. Compare this to upgrading attack power or health, where it's such instant gratification because you can immediately see or feel the upgrade. But with the Dust Storm, it's more like compound interest, where eventually this sort of dinky thing becomes this screen filler of carnage and destruction. On bosses like Fuse, the Dust Storm does help out, especially when he starts moving around, but Fuse is fairly vulnerable to your standard 3-hit combo string, and you can hit him out of some of his attacks. While it is the most intense battle you'll have fought so far, he's not so bad, because the game gives you the tools to effectively beat him. Now those pillars of fire that he sends out are intimidating, but as long as you keep your health items handy, you should be okay. The key is to keep on the offensive, don't give him an inch. But instead of affording you the chance to immediately feel good about your victory, the tone becomes surprisingly somber once you land the final blow. As we'll talk about soon, the major bosses in Dust are most important for their themes rather than for raw challenge. As we learn through the game, the reptilian Moonbloods have been systematically wiped out town by town on a crusade led by one General Gaius. This conflict will frame every event in the story going forward. Fuse lost everything thanks to Gaius' armies, and madness took him. The next major phase of the game takes you deep into the earth to solve the mystery of why monsters from the deep have been spilling out onto the surface, but it soon becomes more dire than that. In the depths, the indigenous dwellers of Mudpot suffer because the waters have been cut off at the source. So your path to restore the waters takes you to the second major boss, this ancient supernatural entity called the Lady, who is really easy in my experience. It's actually quite easy to lock this boss into a response loop without even trying to cheese it. This big claw swipe she does has such a long wind-up that if you're playing with intent to win, it's actually quite difficult to not capitalize on it. So you're dodging just out of range to avoid getting hit, then coming back to attack her, which usually causes her AI to do that same claw swipe again. It's such an easy AI loop to activate, and that's kind of a shame because outside of that, there's a well-designed battle here. The orbs that zero in on your position encourage movement, which combined with that claw swipe gives the fight a nice dynamic, until you inevitably trigger that loop. Just like with Fuse, your conversation with the lady reveals that her actions are also spurred on by Gaius' campaign. She means to deprive the world above of water, so that the destructive campaign may be quelled, but Dust is able to bring her to her senses and restore the flow. But by the time this happens, it's too late to prevent all loss of life. When you first arrived in Mudpot, the plight of this family was used to frame the struggle of the denizens of Mudpot, and this ailing father was the big reason you made haste down to the lady to begin with. And by the time you fix the waters, you're simply too late to save this boy's father. There's no last-minute turnaround, you're just too late. It's on that lingering note that you progress into the darkest corner of the game. To give you context for the boss of the Sorrowing Meadow, I should tell you about the meadow itself. I've been scarcely describing the areas in the narrative flow because I wanted to frame this video around how the boss lore directs the themes, but I think it's important to lay out this context for you. To put it gently, if you go in unprepared, get ready to bite the pillow. The Sorrowing Meadow is one of those true difficulty spikes. I tend to think of it almost as Dust's very own Blight Town, and if you've been neglecting your leveling up to this point because things didn't seem so tough before, you're gonna suffer. You might want to try out the couple challenge trials that are available to you already, just to get an extra edge on that leveling without having to grind. As an aside, there's absolutely no part in this game that wants you to grind, except for a certain side quest which is completely optional, but you're going to want to hit the Sorrowing Meadow prepared. One of the first things you'll encounter in the meadow can best be described as a leaping demon with blades for arms, and he behaves exactly how you expect a leaping demon with blades for arms to behave. Like an asshole. Now guys, maybe I'm letting my creepypasta fandom show a bit, but am I completely insane for thinking this thing feels like it crawled out of the NES Godzilla creepypasta? You can try parrying it, but if you screw it up, this guy hits for such massive damage that you might as well be a giant enemy crab. Stunning it by waiting for it to overcommit to a missed attack and then striking, Dark Souls style, is a good strategy. At that point, you're best keeping this guy stun-locked and going ham on him. You want to stay on the offense with this guy. Overall, it shouldn't be too bad as long as you keep your health items nearby. You know what's super fun though? As you progress through the meadow, this guy becomes a regular recurring enemy. Oh, awesome. I want to go home. You've also got the usual jump and enemy durability that comes natural with finding a new area. You've got these walking tumors that explode and inflict fire damage on you at a point in the game before you found any burn heal items. Now, the dust storm can carry you through a lot of the meadow's encounters, but like any other area, doing that will miss out on a lot of XP. I've talked about how using the dust storm can be pretty overpowered in this game, but the meadow introduces an enemy that is actually vulnerable only to the dust storm and nothing else. These wizard-type things are basically the summoner from Doom 2016. They teleport around, making them harder to pin down, and they spawn enemies, including the ones that explode, which can really make you regret your life choices if you think, oh, I'll just let them spawn all these enemies and kill them as they appear to grind XP. Oh no. You can only kill these wizards with the dust storm, but when they get hit, the wizards teleport around, so depending on how much you leveled your dust storm, it's still tough to actually hit them a bunch of times in a row. Fortunately, you can skip past almost all the wizards, but there are a couple that you absolutely have to fight in order to progress. And for me, these guys reached that threshold where they just weren't worth fighting, so I skipped all the wizards I could. If the controls in Dust weren't as fantastic as they are, then I suspect the Sorrowing Meadow would be an extremely frustrating area. And then there are the haunted houses. The goal of the Sorrowing Meadow is to gather a bunch of keepsakes from the mansions in the region, each located at extreme ends of the map. So you are looking at some backtracking and exploration here, but the map is well designed enough that you don't feel like it's too bad. And yeah, the haunted houses are fucking terrifying. You can't kill or hurt this thing, or even slow it down, you just have to not be under its claw when it swipes. God, this thing reminds me of that freaky giant Kremling pirate skeleton in Donkey Kong Country 2, you know the one. You just have to run away from it, grab the keepsake of that mansion, and get yourself gone faster than you can say, oh hell, it's a horror game now. And that thing, by the way, is the boss of the Sorrowing Meadow. After you've returned all the keepsakes, you get to fight that. This is Cain, a wealthy war profiteer who sold out innocent Moonbloods and their sympathizers to their deaths for money. So with that in mind, it feels damn good to slap down this specter. And here's the thing, after the difficulty spike and oppressive atmosphere of the Sorrowing Meadow, this boss is so easy. Look, I'm doing it! I'm clowning on this tool! There's not even that much to say about this fight compared to the other boss fights. He can summon basic bitches and you still gotta watch out for those exploding guys, but you can just get his pattern loop down and you're sending this Spectre home in suitcases. And you know what, this is really good from a design perspective. There were parts of the Sorrowing Meadow that had me pounding back health items like Tic Tacs on both my playthroughs, and this whole place has that wicked atmosphere that makes it feel like you're never safe. So this boss feels like a necessary breather. That's why it was so important to give you the context of the Sorrowing Meadow. Without such a difficulty spike, Cain would just have been a ridiculously easy boss that felt like a downgrade from the action that preceded it. But before we continue to the icy Blackmoor Mountains, are we starting to see a pattern emerging here? The first major boss was a Moonblood warrior driven to extremism and madness from the tragedy he endured. The second major boss was an elemental entity who resorted to extremism, withholding her life-giving waters from deep in the earth in a bid to stop the destructive fighting above. And now we have the unrested spirit of a war profiteer who sold out the innocent to line his coffers. In all cases, the efforts of these characters to intervene in the war or to profit or revenge themselves in its fallout have a fatal impact on the world around them and the people living in it. The major bosses in Dust seem to be the different faces of war and a reflection of the things that we do in its fallout. One stops the beating of many innocent hearts after losing his own in every way that matters. One is driven to kill innocent and guilty alike for the sake of ending the overall destruction. One let his lust for coin trump his decency and his morality and profited from the carnage. The next boss we see near the base of the Blackmoor Mountains is a minor threat. She's another elemental creature, but she's no dire peril even when she clones herself. Honestly, look how fast she goes down when you're properly leveled. She does become a regular enemy later, but you really don't have to worry about that too much. And the climactic encounter of the Blackmoor Mountains is not a boss per se. Well, that area brings your first encounter against Gaius' soldiers, and they're a tough armored foe who can easily deflect your attacks. But no, the true climax of Blackmoor is the revelation about who Dust is and his place in the struggle of the endangered Moonbloods against Gaius' genocidal forces. I don't want to go too deep into that here, because that's getting a bit off track, but your road after this takes you to the Everdawn Basin, the volcano where the Moonbloods make their final stand against annihilation. Here's where the game's theme is reinforced so strongly through its bosses, the final charge against Gaius. This wouldn't have worked nearly as well if the bosses were a bunch of random big beasties. Oh sure, it would have still been a great game if the bosses were just some big fun monsters, but it would have lacked that extra layer. And that final charge with the Moonblood infantry gets you so pumped up to finish this. It's amazing how well this works as a set piece, considering having a battle like this play out in an entirely 2D space could have easily descended into incomprehensible chaos, but it's absolutely great. But by this point, Dust has slawed his way through the living fallout of Gaius' genocidal crusade, and between that and Dust's voice actor just straight crushing it in the studio, this cutscene is just so good. By this point, you've breathed in the destruction and death, and you want to drive a blade through Gaius' heart just as much as Dust does. And man, could that Gaius battle be any more of a final boss throwdown? You've got the erupting volcano, you've got the destructible arenas that mark each phase of the fight, you've got your Moonblood companions jumping in to join the fight, you've got the epic music that I'm actually playing in the background right now. Gaius is a tough fight, as it should be. Even with your high level and your combos in the Dust Storm, it's likely that you'll still be pounding back health items left, right, center to tank the hits as they just keep coming. And just as an aside, the health items in Dust aren't some fantasy herb or anything like that. They're all real food from a blend of Western and Korean culinary traditions. So imagine how must this actually look from an in-universe perspective. I want you to imagine what must be literally physically happening here. Dust is fighting his destined foe atop an erupting volcano. Soldiers are dying around him, and this mad lad is just pounding back 7 hamburgers, a slice of birthday cake, some crab legs, some kimbap, just scarfing it down in between sword parries. Nobody knows where he's getting this stuff, and nobody questions it. Down goes another burger, then he chases that down with a steaming mug of hot chocolate. God only knows how it hasn't already spilled, but by God it hasn't. Video games are good. But for real, this General Gaius fight is exceptional. They expect you to know your shit at this point, they expect you to have paid attention to your leveling, so this boss throws everything at you. You have to eat your way through several health bars, each phase of the fight taking you to an increasingly dangerous arena. It gets to the point where the floor is literally lava, and he's playing the distance game and keeping his defense up close. Unlike a couple other major boss fights, you're not cheesing this one. Gaius will constantly keep you on your guard and on the move. This is one of those fights where you have to abide by those immortal words, the only way to do it is to do it. If that doesn't sound like much of a strategy, it's because it isn't. You just have to use every trick up your sleeve, everything the game has taught you, and just go hard or go home. So I say again, this is such a great final boss throwdown. And thematically, it's really the catharsis for everything I've been talking about, isn't it? All through the game, the boss battles have laid out the heartbreaking cost of Gaius' war, and now you get to take it out on his hide. And after the final blow is struck, that is Dust and Elysian Tail. I'm not going to spoil the ending because this is a game you really should play. I didn't play it until Limited Run put out their edition, but it fast became one of my favorites in the style. In terms of breaking down the theme as expressed through the gameplay, I thought this would make a nice addition to my boss battle series, because they did such a great job of tying those two elements together. There's actually so much more to talk about, like the tragedy of Ginger, how she begins the game having lost everything, and ends it having lost everything anew, which in itself ties into the game's main themes, or the heavily Korean influence on parts of the game's lore and world building. But the themes that this game expresses through the lore of its bosses are decidedly universal. Hate is a corrosive influence, hatred of those who aren't like you. And if you decide to act on that hate, as General Gaius does as the crux of this game's plot, then the impact of that will bloom outward, ruining lives in so many different ways. And that feels like a downer way to end this, but Dust explores these themes through a world rife with color and personality and charm. I hope you've enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed making it, and I'll see you next time!